this video, we're going to go through some of the big ideas when we're talking about pure competition or perfect competition in the long run to see what some of the logical implications are of all of these assumptions that we talked about previously. So there are a lot of big ideas here, and remember that pure competition and perfect competition, they're just two ways of saying the same kind of thing. I want you to remember that this is just one model. This is just one way that we might think of an industry and all the firms in the industry behaving. Of course, there are the other three common models we talk about: oligopoly, monopolistic competition, and monopoly. And we'll be talking about monopoly coming up pretty soon. But if we lived in a world where these assumptions about pure competition were true, what would logically follow from that? So if we had a world where for every industry there were a lot of firms, and in each given industry they were all selling a standardized product, all selling the same thing, and nobody cared who they bought from because they knew everything was identical. If it was true that firms are price takers rather than price makers, so if it's true that all of these firms take the supply curve and the demand curve as given, and whatever that equilibrium price is, that's the price that they're going to be able to charge, nothing higher, nothing lower. And if it is easy to enter and easy to exit from this industry, there's no law, no big barriers keeping people from entering to produce this product or service, and there's also no reason why they couldn't shut down and exit this industry. There's a fifth assumption that many textbooks don't go into, but it's lurking in the background, so let's make sure that we talk about this. Another assumption is people have perfect information about prices. So one of the fundamental things here is that firms are price takers. The consumers need to know what the market price is, and they need to be able to know that all firms are charging the same thing. In the real world, however, a lot of what we spend our time doing is trying to see what is the best product, right? So it's not a standardized product. And also, what is the best price? So there's not just one market price in the real world. So we're making a strong assumption here. So one of the assumptions we're making is that consumers understand that there's a market price and everybody knows what it is. Consumers also understand that the quality of the goods and the type of goods are truly standardized, and they can't be fooled thinking that one person is selling something better than someone else. This is a very strong assumption that's probably not very realistic most of the time. And another assumption we make is that everybody knows about how much these firms are making in profits. Are they losing money? Are they breaking even? Or are they making profits in this industry? So we assume that everybody knows the truth about this. So if these five assumptions were true about all the firms and all the industries in a market, then what would have to be true? Well then, first thing, as we've talked about previously, the way perfectly competitive or purely competitive firms maximize their profits in the short run is going to be ignoring the downward sloping part of marginal cost, but then producing all units where the marginal revenue is greater than the marginal cost. And we assume that the marginal revenue, by which we just mean the additional revenue coming in when you sell an additional unit, is the same thing as the market price. So every time I go to sell another unit, I can sell it for that market price, suppose it's $10, and I'm going to keep producing units as long as the price is $10 is greater than or equal to the additional cost of making another unit. Unless the price is lower than the minimum average variable cost. Let me write that in there. Let's all write that in there to make sure we know what we're talking about. That shutdown price. Unless price is less than the minimum average variable cost, then shut down and produce zero. So what's the big deal about this? If this is true, that I'm only going to produce if the price is bigger than or equal to marginal cost, and if the price is less than the variable cost, the minimum of my labor and materials costs that I would need to use in order to produce these goods, I'm going to shut down and not produce any. This implies allocative efficiency. So this implies that we're doing something right in this economy if we have pure competition. Why? Well, what's allocative efficiency mean? Let's remind ourselves. Allocative efficiency means that we're allocating resources among firms in society and industries to obtain the production of the products most wanted by society. And how do we know that's true? If the output of each product is where its marginal cost and price and marginal benefit are equal, and that's going to be the place where the sum of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus is maximized. So previously in the semester, when we were talking about consumer and producer surplus, one of the reasons for doing so was to set us up for this moment, so that we could say that, remember, when we were talking about producer and consumer surplus, we were talking about supply and demand. So here's price and here's quantity, and here's a demand curve. Here's a supply curve. And back then, we made careful to talk about how demand represents the marginal benefit of people, the additional willingness of people to pay for additional units of a product. In other words, marginal benefit just tells us how much people value what they're getting. So value is where everything starts. How much do people want each of these things that are being produced? And we measure how much they want or value them by the most they're willing to pay to get another unit. And supply, we said, is also the marginal cost of producing an additional unit. In the background, we were assuming, when we were talking about consumer surplus and producer surplus, that what we were talking about was a pure competition kind of situation here. And we said that in this framework, if we were to add up all of the marginal benefit, or the area under the demand curve here, add up the additional willingness to pay for each additional unit, we got what we call total benefit. And total benefit is the most people would be willing to pay to get that number of units. And when businesses produce those units, down here we're adding up and getting the variable cost, the area under the supply curve. So if you add up all the marginal costs, you get the variable costs. And this is what we've seen when we've been looking at cost tables. And if we have a market price here, again, let's just suppose that's $10, so we have a number to look at, then the difference between the yellow area, the total benefit, the most people would be willing to pay, or the value for all the units that they're buying, put a number down here, suppose people are buying 100 units, then that total value of the 100 units minus the total revenue, which is what they have to pay to get the 100 units, which in this case would be 10 times 100 or $1,000, that the difference between the value and what people had to pay we called consumer surplus, right? So this is the consumer surplus triangle here up top. And then when businesses get the total revenue, $1,000, 10 times 100 in this case, and then they pay their variable costs, the things that they spend more on when they produce more units, that the difference between that total revenue and the variable costs is called producer surplus. And do you remember what businesses do with that producer surplus? The amount of money they have left over after they pay their variable costs, and then they need to use that producer surplus for two things. They need to pay their fixed costs, and then if they have any money left over after they pay their fixed costs, then they will have profit. So all this stuff from previously in the semester is coming back now and hopefully is helping us to make sense of some of these claims about perfect competition. So allocative efficiency here means that firms in a pure competition framework are going to be guided to produce the amount of things and the types of things that people want. And businesses are only going to keep producing them as long as the additional benefit, the marginal benefit, the willingness of people to pay for them, the value for them is greater than or equal to the additional cost of producing them. And then they're going to stop. And they're going to stop producing additional units at this equilibrium point here. So as a firm, I'm not going to use more resources than I need. And how many resources do I need to produce a good? Well, I'm going to keep using resources to produce a good as long as people value that good more than what it costs, or more than or equal to at least the amount it costs me to use those resources to produce them. So let's look at this definition of allocative efficiency one more time to try to digest it again and see how this relates to the perfect competition or pure competition model. So if businesses are producing all the units as long as the price is bigger than or equal to the marginal cost, then we're going to be allocating resources among firms and among different kinds of products and services, among different industries, to obtain the production of products at which the marginal cost and price and marginal benefit are all equal, and at which the sum of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus is maximized. So if we get to that equilibrium point, that sum of the consumer and the producer surplus there is going to be as big as it could possibly be. We're not going to stop before we get to 100. If we did, we would create a deadweight loss, right? So if we stopped at, say, 70 units or something, then we would have this deadweight loss over here. Or if we produce too much, we would have a deadweight loss by overproduction. Say if we kept producing over here where the additional cost was bigger than the value people placed, marginal cost bigger than marginal benefit, then we could create a deadweight loss in here. But a perfectly or purely competitive business is not going to do that. They're not going to keep producing where the additional cost is higher than the market price of $10. So this is one of the big philosophical results of economics, that if we have firms that are purely competitive and they behave in this way that seems to make sense, then society is going to benefit. The firms, as if by an invisible hand, as Adam Smith would say, are going to be guided to use the resources in the right way, to produce the right products using the resources we have in society to make people as happy as possible. Now, what else can we say? Well, let's look at the long run idea. That was more of a short run idea. So B, what's going to happen in a pure competition framework if the price is above the minimum average total cost? Remember, the minimum average total cost is the break-even price. If the price is higher than the break-even price, we're going to make profits over and above that minimum normal profit that is built into fixed costs. So if we're making economic profits, or sometimes we might say extraordinary profits, other firms are going to see this, and in the long run, what's going to happen is this economic profit, or profit above the minimum needed to make an entrepreneur satisfied with having this business, this is going to encourage entry into this industry. More firms will come into the industry. And what happens when more firms enter into an industry? All right, well, we got to go back to supply and demand here. So suppose that today the market price was $10 and the market quantity was 100. And today we have, say, 50 firms in the industry. Once firms see that, hey, those 50 firms that are already in the industry, they're making huge profits. They're making a lot more than I'm making over here doing what I'm doing. That's going to encourage some firms to stop doing what they're doing and enter into this industry. And when more firms enter, that shifts the supply curve to the right. We're going to have this new higher supply curve. That's going to push that price down from $10 down to something lower. Let's call it $7, just for the sake of argument. We see here that if businesses are making profits, if the price is higher than the minimum average total cost, firms must be able to make a profit, and the fact that they can make profits are going to encourage more firms to enter the industry. That's going to increase the supply curve and push the price down. So let's make a notation of this chain of events in kind of a shorthand here. So if the price is bigger than the break-even price, the minimum average total cost, then what's going to happen is firms enter, and the supply curve is going to increase, shift to the right, and that's going to push the price down. And as the price goes down, as firms keep entering and keep pushing the price down, the firms are going to keep entering until that price gets to where the firms are no longer making these extraordinary or positive economic profits. Okay, well, what if instead the price was below the minimum average total cost? Firms are going to be making an economic loss, which means that the firm is not going to be able to pay for all of the factors of production it's using: the land, the labor, the capital, and the entrepreneurship. And so what we would want is if the demand, the desire to have a product is not sufficient to pay for all the resources going into producing this product, then we would hope those resources would find a better use. So we know that if the firm is not able to cover all of its costs, it's making an economic loss, then the entrepreneur is not able to pay themselves what they need to be able to be compensated to stay in this industry. They're going to start to look for other opportunities. So in the long run, this economic loss or inability to compensate all of the factors of production will encourage firms to exit this industry. And when firms exit this industry, the supply curve is going to shift to the left, raising the price. So kind of the opposite of what we saw going on in the previous case. Instead of firms starting at a high price where they were making a profit and that encouraging entry, we are seeing now perhaps the original supply curve was here, and assume at a price of $7, maybe these firms were producing 120 units, but because they are losing money in the long run over the next few months, firms will start to exit this industry, and as they exit the industry, we'll have a new supply curve. Here, the black one, supply curve 2, and as firms drop out, fewer firms in the market competing, the market price will rise. And firms are going to keep dropping out until the firms are no longer losing money. They have to start breaking even. And then, when the firms are breaking even, they're not going to want to drop out of the market anymore. So that brings us to D. Suppose we're already at that point where the price equals the minimum average total cost, that break-even price. Firms have zero economic profit. And I have to keep reminding you, though, that zero economic profit is not a sad thing in an economics class, right? It means that all of our factors of production are being compensated. It's just that the firm is not making extraordinary profits. We build in that normal profit into the fixed costs, which is the minimum amount the entrepreneur needs to keep them happy. So if we're at that point, the firms are like, I'm not really happy, I'm not overjoyed, and I'm not sad, but I'm doing fine. I'm doing kind of as I expected. So in this long run, after the firms have entered to drive the price down to where the price equals the break-even price, or firms have exited to bring the price up, if we're at that price, the break-even price, we call this the long-run price, because there's going to be no incentive for people to enter and no incentive for people to exit until perhaps something else shakes up this industry. And we'll talk about some of those things that might shake up this industry in the next video. So we often call this break-even price the long-run price. Once we're there, ceteris paribus, unless something else changes, we expect to stay there. So what this implies is, in the long run, if every industry in a nation was purely competitive or perfectly competitive, they're also going to have productive efficiency. So remember that allocative efficiency means we're producing the things most wanted by society, and therefore we're going to be allocating resources in such a way to where we're maximizing people's happiness. So people are getting the combinations of goods that society can produce with the resources we have that's going to make them as happy as possible. We've maximized total surplus, so that's allocative efficiency. Are we using our resources in the right way to provide the most satisfaction possible? Productive efficiency is asking the question, are we using our resources to produce as much as possible? So productive efficiency says we want to produce goods in the least costly way. This occurs when production takes place at the output, at which average total cost is at a minimum, and marginal product per dollar's worth of input is the same for all inputs. So let's start with the first part there. We're producing in the least costly way. That means that firms are producing these goods, all firms are producing these goods in the cheapest way possible. And the cheapest way possible is where we have found the minimum average total cost. That minimum average total cost is the lowest cost per unit. So if all the firms are producing things at the lowest cost per unit that's possible, we must be using our resources to produce things as efficiently as possible. Now, another way to think about this, way back to the beginning of the semester when we were talking about production possibilities curves, and we have two goods, consumer goods, I don't know, just break them into two types here, consumer goods and kind of capital goods or investment goods or something like that. And here's our production possibilities curve that shows all the various combinations of consumer goods and investment goods that we could produce. Then to be productively efficient is just to say that we are somewhere on this production possibilities curve. We're somewhere on it, one of these red points perhaps. We're not at somewhere like this green point A, because if we're at a point A, that means that we could, if we used our resources in a different way, produce more of both. So we're not wasting resources. So productive efficiency, if we're producing everything in the cheapest way possible, we're not wasting any of the resources. Allocative efficiency is asking the question, which of these points out here? Is it B or C or D or some other point like E or F? Which of these points, what combination of goods gives society the most happiness possible, the most value that we could possibly generate with the resources we have at the moment? So this is bringing back in a lot of the lessons that we've talked about throughout the semester. If any of these ideas from earlier in the semester, whether it's production possibilities curves, whether it's supply and demand, shifts in supply and demand, whether it's consumer and producer surplus, if any of these ideas are things that you didn't quite get as well as you should have earlier, if you need to remind yourself of some of these things, please make a little list and go back and review them. Because here at the end of the semester in this Principles of Micro class, we are bringing back a lot of these ideas together to see how they all fit together in one cohesive framework when we're talking about pure competition in the long run. So I'm going to end this video here. In the next one, what we're going to do is we're going to look at another cost table, and we're going to build the supply curve for an industry with 100 firms again. And then after we do that very quickly, we're going to do some simulations. We're going to ask the question, how many firms might we need in an industry in order to get the price to that place where the price equals the minimum average total cost and all the firms are breaking even? I'll have a little Excel worksheet that you can all download and that you can do these simulations along with me. So if you have any questions about any of this, as always, please let me know. Otherwise, this is Dr. Berkey signing out. And I wish you the best of luck with all your studies. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.